Still connecting?
And you're live on YouTube. I will be
Okay.
gone.
Perfect. Hello, everyone. We are streaming, I guess, today at May 17th, 8 o'clock, and I'm doing it super formal. I'm sorry. This is going to be pretty much a very informal thing. I just invited a whole bunch of my friends who were Asian because it was Asian Heritage Month, and they're all incredible authors. And I figured, give them a chance to chat about themselves. So I'm going to start from top left, where for me, and call on Ronnie to talk about himself before we go into actual conversations.
Okay, I'm Ronnie. I published under R.R. Virdi recently, and I guess what qualifies for this discussion, published a South Asian-centric Silk Road epic fantasy, book 1, the first binding, which came out last year and just won the Webster Award at RavenCon. I am officially the world's worst Asian because it's in my bio, and I as our pre-talk conversation showed, I am literally living up to that. I am a terrible role model for Asians, and I guess I'll let the next person go.
All right,
that is.
So I am an author of science fiction, fantasy, and horror, and a Nebula finalist. Not in fantasy, unfortunately, but I do a lot of short stories that mix the three, so science fantasy, horror fantasy, things like that.
All right, JC or John?
I guess I need to unmute myself. I haven't done Zoom in ages. JC Kang, I'm guessing I'm the oldest person here. And I write Asian fantasy, have been doing publishing since about 2016 independently.
And you own a sword shop. Like, you got to talk about that, dude. That's pretty cool.
So cool. Yeah, pans the camera to all this.
He's in the sword shop, right? Like, come
I'm
on.
at home right now. This is the guest bedroom, which my wife calls a sword shop.
I mean, yeah, if you have that many.
Yeah, I mean, don't bury the lead, right?
Yeah. All right, Ken, you want to go next?
Yeah, my name is Ken, and I write Asian-inspired urban fantasy. I write with Julia, and we have Ebony Gate coming out in a couple of months, so it's actually almost real. And we also publish an independent series as well called Seattle Slayers.
All right, Jeff.
Okay, hi, I'm JF Lee. I write Asian fantasy, but I write specifically wuxia, so more Chinese-based fantasy. I am based in the Cayman Islands, and that's basically me. Moving on.
All right, Joe. Oh, Joe, you're muted.
Sorry about that. Did not realize I was muted. Hi, everyone. I'm Jo Wu. I am an author who writes a lot of fantasy and science fiction that is influenced by Asian culture and my Asian upbringing and Asian mythology and fairy tales. I wouldn't call myself like a super strictly Asian fantasy writer, just because I'm probably not too familiar with like all the different like tropes and different factors that make an Asian story like Asian, but I guess that's part of why I'm here, because as an Asian writer, there's so many ways to define Asian fantasy, especially in this day and age and in the evolving world.
And Julia?
Hi, so I probably could compete with Ronnie for like worst Asian. Ken and I went to Chinese school together and we got kicked out. So they failed us into conversational Chinese, right? So when you talk about like, do we understand Asian things? And it's like, well, I always have to go to translations, right? Like, I'm very grateful to translators for the work they do, but occasionally we get burned by like some really bad translations. And so I brought some stuff for show and tell today, like when we get to that part later, this like really terrible thing that I bought. Anyway, I'll save it.
You're also a lawyer, right? So like you still hit like that one mark of like You know,
Yeah.
good Asian. Yeah.
Oh, that is like
Oh
that's
God, yeah.
that's like
My
10
parents
points on
were
the
very
Asian
good
scale.
at being Asian, and so they said doctor, lawyer, engineer, and
Yep.
so like
Yep.
I'm a lawyer, my husband's an engineer. So
Oh my
Well,
gosh.
there
Well,
you
there you
go.
go. 2 for 3.
So it's
Yeah,
like
you're fine.
fail Chinese schools -5 points. Doctor, like lawyer, engineer is like +20. I think you came out ahead.
yeah, but my kids don't play musical instruments, -50, right?
Yeah. mine
Are they
doesn't
going to
really-
Harvard? That's +100 though.
Oh no, one's an artist and one's an athlete. Even
Oh.
worse.
Screwed.
You're not doing very well here, but you know, I can't complain. Mine's got fired by his violin teacher. So, you know,
Oh
what can
my
I
God.
say? All right. And coming in late is Aparna.
Hello. Thanks for exposing me. I couldn't find the link. Hi everyone. My name is Aparna. I am an Indian American writer, so I write a lot of books centered on the South Asian diaspora. And my first book, The Phoenix King, my debut, is coming out this August. And these are like some of the characters that you'll see. So a lot of brown, beautiful people. And it's inspired by Hinduism and Indian mythology, specifically Indian goddesses like Ma Durga and Ma Kali. So yay for female rage.
I guess I should introduce myself. I write all of these books. My name's Tao Wong. I do a lot of lit RPG and science fiction fantasy. Yeah. So technically the name of this conversation is Beyond the Western Canon, Exploring Asian-Inspired Fantasy. But really, I just did this because I wanted to chat with my friends on a in a public way and embarrass all ourselves. So anyone want to go take off with any questions or any comments about the topic beforehand?
I mean, I guess there's something that I've always loved about all of, I guess, Eastern mythology, because like anyone who follows my Twitter knows this, I'm a giant comparative mythology nut, is that there's so much beauty that's shared throughout Asian cultures in terms of similarities in some of our myths, because so many of us traded, or our people traded across the Silk Road. People migrated, food, vegetables, crops were traded. We know materials did, and through that we see like little bits of homophily. Like there's similarities between the myths of the Monkey King and then the monkey god Hanuman in India. And a lot of different tropes throughout the ages have actually filtered between different Asiatic countries that like create this really, really nice similarity that I guess that even if you read a different Asian culture than your own, you can still feel some kind of similarity that feels comforting, or like, oh, I understand the cultural expectation. Just like the jokes we were all making about like doctor, lawyer, engineer, we're all different kinds of Asian, but like certain things do the same stuff in all of our stories. And I always just thought that was kind of beautiful, because I grew up before seeing a lot of my own stuff in mythology when I was old enough to understand it. The earliest introduction to Asian cultures I had was actually Chinese, to martial art films like wuxia, like JF Lee was saying, like, you know, early Shaw Brothers, like Return to 36 Chamber of Shaolin and stuff. And there were some still familiarities, like the way people treated each other, societal and hierarchical behavior and stuff that was still similar to Indian culture. And I always just thought that was cool.
Yeah.
Yeah, one of the early NetGalley reviews that we got like made me cry, because they were saying they liked the way that the diaspora bleed through was happening, even in our book, and how it mirrored real life neighborhoods. And so like what is saying, like, yes, like country designations are political, but you know, culture is more porous than that, right?
Yeah. It's interesting you're talking about mythology, actually, Ronnie, because one of the things when I was trying to put this together, and you know, inviting all my friends, is I realized I didn't really know any Malaysian or Filipino authors, really, other than K.S. Vilicio, and I've completely spaced on inviting her because I am very spacey. I'm so very sorry about that. But even though I know that there are authors, I don't know them personally. So, but I know, you know, looking at something like Tres, which is a very Filipino cartoon on Netflix, some of their monsters and whatnot is very different. I grew up in Malaysia, and some of the stories we have, I would say it's almost it's not similar in some ways to what I would consider Asian Chinese or Japanese East Asian kind of stories, and or potentially and I don't know Indian the Indian subcontinent stories very well. So you guys, I'm sure you and Aparna are going to correct me that there is going to be a whole bunch of things that I missed, but it doesn't seem like there's as much, I don't know, crossover.
Well, one thing like Ken and I found when we were researching, at least on the Chinese side, is mostly they were ghosts, right? So they were like non-corporeal. So coming from like the Western lens of what we grew up reading, we always think in terms of like monsters that you can fight with your sword, right? And then all of a sudden you have a much more sort of like mystical view of what is dangerous and what is scary to a certain population. And so that made us reframe, like, how are we writing these scenes, right? If we're dealing with ghosts, right?
And there are similarities depending on what kind of like myth you want to take, because there's also folk tales and folklore. So like one Filipino creature I'm familiar with, because I've actually used it in my urban fantasy series, is a danag. I might be pronouncing it wrong, but it's a Filipino kind of vampire. And South Asian mythology also has that, but then the vampire transcends that, because the vampire comes from the idea of a phage, which means to feed. If you reduce it down, the end of the day, what it is a creature that feeds on something, whether it's flesh or it feeds on blood, or I believe in Chinese mythology, and someone can pronounce it, I won't say it wrong, but it's the Kyung-shi. It's a chi vampire. It feeds on your spiritual essence. So the idea of like
Jiang.
Thank you. Yeah, because I knew I was going to say it wrong.
The Jiang shirt. Yeah, no.
I love the Jiang. They're my favorite.
There are weird correlations to everything. One, and Parno probably knows, and this is going to get into white people stuff too for a second, but the famous myth, the story behind Jesus, the virginal birth. South Asian mythology has one too, with Surya and Kunti. The sun god blesses Kunti and gives her a boon, and that happens to be a child, but it's a virginal birth. And in some iterations, and someone can hopefully correct me on this, but isn't Lao Tzu or Lao Tse, his birth is also argued to be a virginal birth. So we have certain like similarities between famous key figures and storylines as well through mythology and folktale. It's just which ones do you want to pick, because I guess as the myths evolve and they fall into the larger stories that they're part of, people kind of miss the similarities, because it's not necessarily focused on, that one aspect where the similarity exists, because you have the larger tale to like take your attention.
I think that's what's one of the great blessings of the time period we live in right now, is the fact that we have these conversations, like this panel, like where we can learn about all of Asia, all their stories, and East Asian, South Asian, Southeast Asian, whatever. It's like so much mythology, so many cool things that, like, to the name of this panel discussion, is beyond the Western canon. Like, if I see another story about Greek gods or Norse gods, I might do something dramatic, right?
Because you said that, like 3 more Norse retellings just got published and sold.
Like,
right
and a Fae story, and another Fae.
It's gonna start flipping tables, right?
And then how dare we like write another book about the journey of the West, and they're like, there's already another Journey to the West book. Or
Water Outlaws.
Or my agent submitted my novel to one publishing house, and they were like, we already have a book about fox spirits. And I'm like,
you're only allowed one minority story. You're only allowed one minority story per publishing house, and they've got
but like, how many stories do we have about one human girl in a fairy with a fae prince? Like, come on, you can have another fox spirit story, right?
Yeah.
Or another Monkey King retelling. It's totally okay.
Yeah. It's just a sad reality of where publishing's at right now. Like, I don't. Well, actually, this might get into a hot topic issue, so I'm going to try to phrase this carefully. But because this is Asian Pacific Islander month and everything, like, how many of us are actually represented in the industry on the industry side, not on the artist side creating, but in terms of acquisition, publishing, marketing, because that might be part of why this issue is happening. Because like you're not the first person to mention that, like, the reduction of, we already have one.
Yeah, I was going to comment on that because Ronnie, we've talked about this. My editor is Priyanka at Orbit, and I feel so blessed to have an Indian American editor because she just gets like some of the things I'm going through. It's like I don't have to explain it. She understands the cultural background. And I think it really helped going from self-published to traditional published to get like Orbit to pick up the books because she knew the value in it. She recognized it immediately because she was from the same diaspora. And I think without really having her there, it would have been much harder to sell it to a traditional publisher.
Actually, a quick question, and hopefully people know how to use this. Drop a hand if from the reactions if you are either hybrid or trad pop on this panel. Oh yeah, physical hands at work as well.
Yeah, so I'll just say it. I'm hybrid. I started indie like in 2013, right before right after the gold rush.
Yeah,
it includes you too.
Does it though? Does it?
Yes.
I'm technically still indie.
If we've only
you have a Nebula in a short story.
Well, I can count short stories.
Is trad pop.
Yeah, that counts. That counts.
Yeah,
that's why I said hybrid or trad.
Published.
Okay.
Yeah.
That counts. So it's almost like a half and half split in here. Surprising. There's a couple of you who are on here who actually there's a large majority are hybrid. For those who are trad, I think I is about the only one who's pretty much trad only. But that's mostly because she's mostly doing so far novellas and shorts, right?
Yes.
But that's changing, right?
I have no idea where I'm gonna go. There's still a long path to see.
Not a bad thing.
Your first novel, and
Still working on it.
Nebula nomination. No one can take that away from you.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
I would say
hybrid is kind of like how you future-proof your career as a creative, right? I mean, trad has this incredible distribution and the way that they view book making, like the making of a beautiful product and all of that. It's like their own thing. But I think as indies, we know that like we can pivot, we have some flexibility, we're fine with rolling up our sleeves and doing the work, right? For that, because you wear every hat, right?
And I think that's kind of important at the time we're entering right now, because we talked about certain stuff before the panel started. In the industry, we're seeing technological changes that are maybe affecting stuff like covers because of AI, the AI writing, and what that might mean, especially for us being Asian authors. Like, I know me personally, I would never want an AI cover. I don't want to lose that certain, not necessarily control, but the idea to capture certain vision, because people like us don't necessarily have it represented all that often on our covers. We might have to fight for it. And then the AI could be like another step that helps, take that away. In my personal case, like I was very fortunate, but my indie artist, because the first binding was originally going to be indie published before Tor bought it, they let me keep him and brought it back. And we got to make sure it was a very Asiatic cover that focused on some of the elements I wanted, the art style, featuring, obviously a South Asian protagonist on the cover. And, that was something I wanted because I knew at least indie would allow me to have. I'm glad I got it traditional, but then there is that reason for, I guess, the benefits of indie with while we're being in like, I guess, uncertain times.
Yeah. Sorry, John, you wanted to say something?
Oh, sorry.
Oh, yeah. Earlier, I was going to say that, as much as we can complain about things that are going on in the trad sphere, it's come a long way since like even 2015. Prior to 2015, everything that was like an Asian story was written by a non-Asian person. And then you sort of see Cindy Pond coming in with her first story, which didn't get much traction. But then by 2018, 2019, all of a sudden there's a big explosion with Fonda and Rebecca, and they have all these great books that are coming out. And the traditional publishing sphere is acquiring more and more. So I think, we definitely need more out there, but I think we have definitely come a very, very long way.
Yeah.
I would say, since I'm also an audiobook narrator, that I keep seeing castings where they very thankfully say, we want a narrator of this descent. And I'm just like, thank you, because I recently listened to a book, and I will not say the title.
Say the title.
No.
Write it
Okay,
down
fine.
on
The
a private
author is
chat. I'm
okay.
curious.
Yeah, the author is dead. I will say it. It was like The Demon of Nanking, and it was a dual narration with a male and a female, and it was horrendous because these were, I mean, I'm not to bash on the actors. They were good narrators with good voices, but the fact that they were voicing like this old Chinese Nanking massacre survivor with a fake Chinese accent was
no.
absolutely jarring and incredibly disrespectful, especially given the content of the story. And I mean, the author was white, and the whole book was a hot mess because even without the narration, the book really, to put it nicely, was insulting to what happened in Nanking.
Okay, but because John's was said that like trad has changed a lot, like Canon had a super positive experience with Macmillan Audio for Ebony Gate. They like the audio director reached out to us and said, "Do you have thoughts?" And we said, "We do have thoughts." And then Natalie Naudus narrated the book. And
Wow, yeah.
Natalie, if you're
Nice.
watching this, we love you.
She had an
Natalie's
entire
killing it.
list of words that they wanted, pronunciations for, and then we had like a hot week where we had to go out and source pronunciations for all of these words, and we just handed them off to them, just one big file, and they chopped it all up, and they did a great job with it.
Oh,
it was also very challenging for us because when we were writing these things down, I don't know that we knew how these things were pronounced when we were writing it in the first place.
I mean, I guess for those of us who where our family language is not our first language, do you guys generally go to, say, family to consult on pronunciations or things that could get lost in translation?
a bit. I have the biggest problem I grew up in Malaysia, right? So I grew up around Cantonese mostly, but my family's Hakka, right? And I picked up a bunch of Hakka and a bunch of Mandarin along the way. So I'll be writing something, and I can't remember if I'm using Cantonese. I don't even know if I'm using Cantonese or Mandarin, but I know how it sounds to me, and it sounds fine. And then I go look into it actually and go, oh crap, that's not actually how. I switched to Cantonese, or occasionally it's like, oh, I switched to Hakka here. Why the heck did I use a Hakka name? Oops. And now that's often after it's been published. So it's just like, oh boy.
Yes, but when you're indie, you can go change it if you want.
I did that a couple times when we were researching things for all of our books. If I ran into something, I would go to my parents, because a lot of my initial exposure to Chinese mythology was through them. And so I went back and asked them, like, about this and about that. And it's really interesting conversation with my parents, because in some cases I hadn't talked to them about this kind of stuff in years. And then my mom's just like, her eyes are wide, and she's like, why are you asking me about all this stuff? And unfortunately, I grew up here in the States. I was born here, so I'm about as thin-skinned of a banana as you can get. There's a lot of white on the inside of me, and I totally feel what you're talking about, Tao, as far as the language, because my Chinese is a mix of Taiwanese and Mandarin, and there are times when I'm trying to talk to, like, especially my grandparents when they're around, and what I was saying would just be a mashup of Taiwanese and Mandarin, and I wouldn't even know I was doing it, but I just grew up with hearing both of those languages, and I just didn't know which was which in a lot of cases.
Yeah,
That's interesting.
I'm pretty similar with that as well, because my family were from Singapore, so and I learned my Mandarin as a second language, and I'm quite fluent in it, but there's still aspects of it where I'm like, I don't know how to actually say this. I asked Joe the other day, like, how do I translate the title of my book into Chinese? But yeah, I consult with my parents, and then because kind of like where you guys are coming from, like Tao and Ken, like my parents, because they're from Singapore, they speak all of the above, right? So they lay down the law. Like I remember as a kid being laid down, having the law laid down on me in like in China, in Cantonese, Mandarin, Hokkien, a bit of Malay and English. It's like, oh. And then it was also, one of the coolest moments of my life was when I went with my dad to Singapore. It was a few years back, and he ordered a dish in 5 languages. Like the conversation did not skip a beat. It was 5 different languages from start to finish. And I was just sitting there in awe, like, who is this man that raised me? Like, how did he get so cool? I thought he was kind of cool. Fill in the blank of whatever you think your dad is. But, so for me, like I still, even, I always feel like a foreigner in a sense. Like it's not natural to me to think in Chinese. I still have to get a second opinion from somebody else who's more Asian than I am. It's like, does this the trope feel right? Does this sound normal? Is this translation okay? But that's part of the fun, I guess, right?
That's fascinating though, because like for me, I mean, same thing, diaspora, born here, but like my first languages were actually Hindi and Punjabi, because my parents, and this is not indicative, I guess, of everyone's family that does this, but for them, that was like the way we kept home. Like my dad would only speak English because he was a cab driver, like in DC for like, Americans. He was touring when he came home, that he only spoke in Hindi and Punjabi. And that was like, I guess, because my parents, for them, the immigrant experience was, I guess, terrifying or whatever. That was the one way they could feel safe. So I actually spoke those 2 languages growing up before I learned English. I didn't learn English until I was in like, American school. It's like whatever it is before preschool. It's a Montessori, like a daycare education system. And that's where I learned English. But I've had the exact opposite experience where, because I'm still inherently diaspora, I have to sort of prove my South Asianness. And like I could speak like Hindi, for example, better than some of my cousins, even though they were born there, because for them, the pressure was to learn English because that's the international language. That's the better English. So if you have money or something, you go to an English medium school and you learn English at the same time as your Hindi. And that means you might have to compromise on a little bit because your English is more valuable now because you're being raised for an international market. But there's that still inherent that because I was born here, it's never going to be as good enough, even if it is or better. And I thought that was really interesting because I'm only seeing that now once publishing's put me in that marketplace of like, oh, I'm a South Asian author. And I get people like starting to question the South Asianness. And I'm like, I've never had anyone do that before. Like I'm the only one of my siblings who can speak Hindi and Punjabi fluently because I guess like as it went to the next generation, I spoke English to them. So I guess it's like my fault, but like my little sister can't speak any. Yeah. Like they don't speak it. Like they can sort of understand it, but they don't speak it all. Like my youngest one will not speak. She just like will nod and then just return in English. And it's like, it's so weird for me because I still to this day, my parents won't speak English with me in the house. Like they will just, it's just Hindi and sometimes Punjabi, depending how mad like my father gets or how drunk. That's the drunk language.
It's the same with me. Like my parents, we only speak Hindi at home. When I call them on the phone, it's only like Hindi, and it's great for me also to practice. And I feel like I was definitely not as fluent until I started going back to India and visiting once we got our green card. So I was born in India. Like I was born there, but I immigrated to the States when I was 2. So pretty much grew up, here and assimilating here. But I think my Hindi got a lot better once I like hung out with my cousins and like went to India pretty frequently, like every 2 years or so. And I like pick it up and now I'm like really fluent. I wish like I can read it. I don't know how to read it. So there's a lot of Hindi poetry that I would really love, or Urdu poetry that I would really love to access, but I can only access it through translation. And that takes away some of the musicality, which is too bad.
So Aparna, do you get the same thing that Ronnie does with people questioning the authenticity of your?
Oh, for sure. It's like, I remember seeing like one review by accident on TikTok, and I like, said, this is not for me. Like I only saw the first few. But I remember looking at someone said like, oh, I felt like the representation was all over the place, which I was like, that to me, that's such a warped, and as R.F. Kwong said in her newsletter, it's a B+ interpretation. Or for me, it's a C-
that's good
interpretation of the book, because to me, it's like, how do you capture the South Asian diaspora when it's billions of people? Like there's so
many experiences.
There's so many experiences, and like I am from more so northern India, so if someone from South India or East India were to read the book, there might be aspects of it that to them might not be correct, but it's correct to me because
Exactly.
I grew up with that. Yeah, like I grew up with that. I had that. And so it's really interesting to me when people say, like when we look at Asian shows or South Asian shows or East Asian shows, I think we're always asking for representation, begging for it, because we get so few in between that we put those media, whether it's a book, a TV show, movie, on a pedestal, and we criticize them for missing even one beat of quote unquote Asianness.
Yeah.
Right? Like, I think some great movies, like I'm thinking about like for like South Asian, like the Never Have I Ever show that's on Netflix by Mindy Kaling. I'm not the biggest fan of her humor. I think it's just The Office, but like worse. But I love her. I think it's amazing because like some of it just felt too teenager. I mean, and like that's a show. It's like very YA teenager. But I remember but everyone was like, I remember just seeing on Twitter, like people were saying, oh, like Mindy Kaling again, like she is so insecure, hates herself and hates Indian women because her main character is like insecure, hates her skin, etc. And I'm like, wait, she's 16 years old. She's a teenager. Of course she's insecure. Of course she's like wants to like get with the hottest guy in school because you're a teenager. You're supposed to, like, you're acting that way for a purpose. Or I'm thinking about even with Everything Everywhere All at Once, right? With the East Asian representation. And like when the Oscars came, people were saying that Michelle Yeoh was Chinese, but I think she's actually Singaporean or Malaysian.
Malaysian.
And like,
don't take away from it.
Yeah.
Malaysia.
Yeah,
Singapore
right.
steals enough Malaysian stuff.
No,
Takes credit for it.
So that's what I saw on Twitter. Like everyone's like, oh, the first Chinese like American woman to wear an Oscar, and people were saying like, no, she's Malaysian. And so like you see people squabbling for scraps of representation because we get so few in between, which I just want to like take people by the shoulders and shake them. It's like, can you take a step back and realize we're finally, like, if we keep dogpiling and nitpicking, like this was inaccurate or this was this, I think it slows down actual progress, and having more media projects that speak to all kinds of the diaspora, where I feel like I hope that one day we're going to get to a point where we have a Malaysian show, a Singaporean show, South Indian show, a North Indian, East Asian, Assamese, like literally everyone gets represented, but that won't happen if we keep dogpiling and nitpicking. It's like, oh, that wasn't Asian enough for me.
That's something that happened to me, which really sucks. And like I didn't tell us because we have a South Asian diaspora group, by the way, like we all dish there. But so I did talk about this on Publishing Rodeo, which hasn't aired yet. But I got a review from a prominent magazine, by the way, in SFF, where the reviewer wasn't South Asian, and they started like having little takes about questioning the South Asian authenticity. And I kind of wanted to like, thankfully I didn't go public with it, but I was like, who are you to be like questioning that? Because one thing I made a special point of for anyone who reads my book is I go very heavy on the food. And this comes from personal life experience because I've worked in the food industry a lot. But I believe one of the best ways to get in touch with people's cultures is to learn the foods. Regional. And I'm very passionate about this. And like for South Asian cuisine, for example, we have like, I can think of 17 different ones off the top because there's Punjabi cuisine, there's Rajasthani, there's Kerala, there's Tamil Indian cuisine, Kerala, Andhra Pradesh, and all these exist because
I'm hungry.
Yeah, Haryani.
Yeah, but we have so many different microclimates in a place that's a subcontinent. So because that, you're going to grow different foods, and China is no different because there's so many different regional cuisines, which means there's regional cultures behind that cuisine making it the way they do, which means you're going to have so many different cultural interactions, micro dialects, and that changes so much, including localized folklore. Because I'm a mythology nut, like you can't encapsulate this the way Aparna was saying, because you reduce the beauty of any group and culture down to like this tiniest microcosm, when in fact the thing that makes it amazing is the fact that there's countless microcosms, this wide expanse of it. And it's something that I think like we still have to fight for in publishing, like the ability to tell stories in that tradition and way. It's something I've had to be fighting for with like the word counts of my books because I'm writing a framed narrative. And for those who don't know, the oldest framed narrative in the world is the South Asian epic Mahabharata. Which many people might pronounce Mahabharata, but it's the first iteration of a framed narrative with nesting stories inside. And I'm specifically using that format But that means it's going to lend to a higher word count, and I have to keep fighting and explaining to my publishers like, hey, there's certain South Asian literary techniques and payoffs and mythology nesting stories that I'm doing that reference real ones, which are going to inflate the count of the book. But to be accurate to like a tradition, something that there's not much of, I have to do it this way. And then the argument is that hopefully one day it leaves room for somebody else to do something similar or in the vein, however they want. That's also South Asian.
That's so fascinating because like we're all here on this panel because we all want to represent our culture and stuff in a significant way, in this literary way, and to the point of like, I love that what you're saying, Aparna, about we're fighting for scraps of representation. And
we should not gatekeep each other.
We really shouldn't.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, and that's the thing is like I've been thinking about it in this discussion. It's like it's so much of it is based on identity and what we believe to be, our identity. Just to kind of put it in a bit of perspective. I remember all the dialogue that came out when Shang-Chi came out and how there were people that loved it and some people were like, that's not my culture. And I'm like, yeah, that's not your culture, but it's definitely representative of West Coast Chinese diaspora. I mean, Julia and Ken, maybe you guys understand that. But then, and I write wuxia, so I was like really focusing on the Chinese aspect of my identity, the Chinese part. And then I watched Raya and the Last Dragon. And I realized I had completely ignored the Southeast Asian, the Singaporean, Malaysian, that aspect of my entire identity, because that was not the part of the identity that I identified with, since Singapore kicks me out and I can't go back, but that's another story, NS stuff. But but it's like that was a whole aspect of, it's not me, but it was definitely something that resonated with my parents. They loved Raya. They thought it was so cool to see a Disney film that had the elements of their childhood on TV, on the screen. And then for me, that was like this mind-opening, eye-awakening kind of thing where I was like, oh, there's more to my cultural story than just what I think is my narrative. And I think that's just kind of the thing that goes along with so many other people out there. It's like we're fighting for the scrap because that's the only scrap we have of our identity representation, and I tell this to my white friends all the time, and if it comes up about culture and race and stuff like that, I say, you don't know how much of myself I've had to suppress just to fit in with you guys. Like, you don't know how much I've had to change just to fit in here. The me that you're seeing right now is not is just the tip of the iceberg. This is just the side that I'm showing you. Like the real me, like the real authentic, that maybe I feel like the real authentic me is the one that speaks Singlish at home, like what you're saying, Ronnie, that you speak your native language at home. That maybe is the more authentic self, right? And it's like that, you don't get to see that. Nobody gets to see that unless you're part of that. And so I think it's just this fascinating thing that we all want to be represented. We all want our specific cultural background on the screen. And one day we'll get there. Like, we are on this panel because we want that reality to come forth, and we are pushing that.
Yeah. Like I have a 12-year-old, so I'm a tween, and like the amount of books in middle grade that have so much AAPI like story and protagonist, and I mean, even like we're reading Zachary Ying right now by Zhang Zhao, and like, they even have like the Hui culture in there, like a minority, right? So I felt like this is amazing. This is like a whole time where we get really special things. Like we get to have this good stuff.
So
like
cool.
we could go every day the month of May and have a different AAPI author to profile.
So cool.
It really has, actually. I mean, we complain about this, and we complain about different aspects because we are running into it. But compared to like 10, 20, 30 years ago, the work that we are seeing, the stuff that we're seeing, is so nice and different. And it's, it's, as we said, it's hopefully it'll just get better. It should get better.
It will, because of people doing this stuff.
Yeah. Like accurate representation. Yeah. Like I think the worst offender for me was Star Trek Voyager. Anybody a Trekkie? Harry Kim right? Harry Kim, the actor was Chinese. There was nothing in it that made him Korean in the entire 7 seasons of Star Trek Voyager. And it's like, why didn't you change his name to Wong to like actually to match up with his cultural background? Like, why was he still Harry Kim? Like, anyway, that was off track. Sorry.
I think I'm here thinking that Julia, Ken, and I are probably the older. We're Gen Xers, right? Tao, you might.
Tao, yeah.
Wait, which one's Gen X? I always forget. No, I'm kidding. Isn't that the Gen X joke though, right? Like which one are you guys?
And I'm just thinking, I mean, it's like you guys grew up in a different
dating
situation. Grew up in a different society almost. The United States has changed so much. The Western world has changed so much in terms of the availability of what we have now in terms of these stories. And at the same time, all of us sort of straddle like these multiple cultures. And I wonder how much that influences our writing styles and the approach to things. I mean, we were talking about Eastern tropes, but how many of those overlap with Western tropes? I'm sure there's like kind of a Venn diagram where there's some things like lost heirs and all sorts of stuff all end up. But I wonder how much our writing is influenced by. Yeah.
But I can't talk about that because then because my background is comparative mythology, which I specifically study and I lecture on panels about. If we start that'll be a 3-hour conversation of me talking about Proto-Indo-European myths and how all of Western myths.
Ronnie, I want to have this conversation with you sometime.
We could do it over Twitter or another thing, but like we had a panel at JordanCon with like Wes Chu and Andrea Stewart, and they just were like, "You can talk the whole time," because they heard me, and I was like, "Oh God, I feel so bad." But like, yeah, that is literally my thing. And my argument comes down to most of all of Western mythology comes from Eastern mythology, and I can prove it.
It's funny because I was teaching a workshop today to some young South Asian creatives who are mostly working on like horror and mystery stories. But we were talking. Did a workshop about South Asian myths and how to use your culture to inform your stories. And I was talking about how death is used a lot. Like death is universal. It's used. There's so many death myths throughout the universe, and I was talking specifically how there's a Greek myth and there's an Indian myth that are very similar but have different endings when it comes to death. So I think it's a Eurydice and is it Odysseus?
Eurydice and Orpheus,
or Eurydice and Orpheus, where Orpheus Eurydice like dies, Orpheus goes to Hades. They struck a deal where Orpheus is like he can take her back to living world, but he can't turn back and look at her. And if he does, she's lost forever. And right at the threshold holds so much meaning throughout so many myths. He turns around, he sees her, and he loses her forever. And this is all about striking a deal with death, and death giving you actually a way out, but losing it. There's this Indian myth in the Mahabharata called, there's 2 of them actually. There's one of Savitri and Satyavan. Where Savitri, and this is really cool. It's a female-led myth where her husband dies and she actually chases the Lord of Death across all kinds of terrains and gets almost like 3 wishes. And it's like in a stroke of genius, her last wish is like, I want 100 sons. And Lord Yama like grants her the wish, but she's like, wait, how can I have 100 sons if my husband's dead? And instead
loophole.
Loophole. And instead of getting angry, it's like you tricked me, like little human. I think what's really interesting, especially in in Eastern myths and Hinduism, is that the gods are like grant boons and actually award human intellectualism, versus like Christian and Western myths do not. Like they strike down knowledge, the pursuit of knowledge, while Eastern myths help you, like they encourage the pursuit of knowledge. And so she actually gets her husband back and they have 100 sons. So but like that's so
cool.
But like it's 2 very similar myths, but they have very different endings. It's like striking a deal with death and outwitting death, but like one, you lose your love forever because you can't, it's like willpower wins over, versus here you have cleverness and maybe it's like women's ingenuity. But I just think that's so cool, to Ronnie's point. Like there's so much myths that are similar and hold hand in hand, but there's ways that they diverge, which I think tells a lot about the different cultures that are in relation to each other.
Because you brought that up, I want to point out there's actually even more of the exact same myth. So Japan has their version, which is Izanami as a guy. And then the Norse have Brynhilde and Sigurd. And the Sigurd is, I gotta be really careful because I will start talking for an hour about comparative mythology. But he's famous for being a dragon slayer, and every culture has a dragon slayer myth, which is very identical. But eventually he dies because of Brynhilde, and her, it's the same thing where it's gender bent. She goes to hell to sort of declare her love and get him back. Through it, in her case, she's tested to prove her love because she's sort of responsible in some iterations for his death. And instead, she ends up reuniting with him in hell, and they stay there. And again, this isn't like Christian hell, so it's not necessarily a place of punishment. It's just the underworld. So they're reunited, but they stay in some versions of the myth there. But there's also an Egyptian version of this. So now we're up to like, what, 5 or 6 cultures that have the exact same, trying to find a way through death with your lover, and either getting them back or finding a way to reunite with them.
There's a Native American myth too about coyote.
Yep. And I know there's one more and I'm blanking on it, but yeah, to keep this not from turning into me talking for 2 hours. So anyways, but yes, again, it goes to the point of how much similarities there are throughout mythology and cultures.
Yeah.
That's really, really cool. Wait, so back to the generation thing. Like, you guys are Gen Xers, and I'm guessing the rest of us are millennials then?
I think Aparna is Gen Z, right?
She said she taught young people. I'm like, what is young to her?
Pretty sure I's Gen Z too.
Oh God,
are you Gen Z?
I'm just gonna call them the
Joe.
TikTok
I haven't
generation.
actually met
That's
Joe
what they
in
are.
person, so I can't tell.
It's like most of us are Facebook and MySpace, and everyone else is just TikTok. That's how I'm breaking this down. Yeah. Wait, did you just say Friendster?
Oh, I said Friendster because I'm just saying.
What's that?
Wow.
Yeah, you young people even know what I'm talking about.
That was a blip, though. I'm sorry. Friendster doesn't really count.
No, but that just like
came and
shows the
went.
Gen X-ness right there, though. The fact he remembered that. I didn't until you said it because I heard of it. But
Oh gosh.
Oh my God. That was, God, Friendster was.
oh no! Now what was the other
6
not.
degrees? Remember 6 degrees? There was a website called 6 Degrees, which was a way to connect everyone within 6 degrees of each other.
Oh
That was
yeah, 6 degrees of Kevin Bacon.
Classmates?
That was fun.
What was it? It was Classmates or something, right? That was like right before Facebook by 2 years, and like people sort of used it, and then they just went away because Facebook was a better version of it. God,
It
that
was
was
like
so bad.
MySpace and Hot or Not. Remember Hot or Not?
Oh God, no, I don't. I've never heard of that.
Like, never heard of it. I was definitely not on there.
I was gonna say ICQ was. I don't know even how many. Okay,
on ICQ.
we're leaving
Yahoo.
behind the
Yeah.
Gen Z people. They're like, what?
Yeah, we're like, what is
Hot or Not is still functioning?
It is.
Why?
Have representation, right? I think that's what John is getting at. And so Ken and I asked each other this about this book, and we asked in our Facebook group, but we had this book called The 5 Chinese Brothers. It was the only book I had as a kid with Chinese representation. Now, it's problematic now. Like, you look at it now and you're like, okay, it's a retelling by a non-Chinese author, and these 5 Chinese brothers are painted literally yellow and they look the same. So,
Oh God.
You had the 5, I had the 7, my dad had the 10. Chinese brothers.
Right.
So, like,
So then Ken and I were trying to track down the original folklore story. Like, where did
You
it
can still
come
buy
from?
the book on Amazon.
Yes, I have a copy still.
Mhm.
But we were like, oh, it's 5, it's 7, it's 10. Like, it actually was pretty difficult to say like there was one original story, right? It kind of was like pervasive, but like about clever brothers, and it was like any random number.
Just out of curiosity.
Horribly illustrated children's picture books growing up. Does anyone remember the Korean Cinderella?
No.
I'll be back.
So,
She
am I
goes
the
into
only
her
one who
literal
didn't grow up
library
in North
here.
America?
I think so. I think everybody
Okay.
else grew up in North
It's-
America.
It's very strange for me sometimes listening to, you all talk about growing up, in North America and not having representation and everything, because I grew up in Malaysia, and so that never really came out. I mean, we were heavily, British, English, influence, both in my studies and everything else. But representation wise, I always had, all the Hong Kong movies and everything and everyone around. So it's always kind of weird. Anyway, Joe had something.
Joe.
Well, before I get into that, Tao, like, I know it's so interesting, just like growing up, I felt very lucky that growing up, I had parents who they weren't ashamed of their culture. They weren't like those parents that were like, oh, we need to assimilate as much as possible. So I grew up watching like Mandarin Chinese dubbed anime and like Shouting Dong, if anyone remembers.
Yeah.
Xiaoxing. And for those of you who don't know what they are in Chinese, it's Doraemon and Crayon Shin-chan. I loved those growing up, and a lot of C dramas. So to me, like, I did get those Chinese Asian representation, even if they weren't through like, the American and white gaze. It wasn't until I was a little older where I was like, oh shit, Hollywood just really screws us over with representation. Anyway, I brought out two versions of the Korean Cinderella picture books. I don't know if this will show up, but
Can't really see it.
yeah. So Korean Cinderella, the cover is beautiful and the artist herself is very talented, but then you get an interior illustration like, here, let me see, like this. I don't know if I can bring it close enough without blurring, but it was like,
Oh, wow.
she clearly does not know how to draw Asian faces. And then I have another version, which was actually written by, I think, a Korean American author, Konji and Pachi. I mean, that's the alternative title for the Korean Cinderella, and also illustrated by I don't know if it's Korean or Korean American illustrator, but this one was like, you could definitely see, for instance, like how the faces are drawn. It's a huge contrast where it's very pretty. You can definitely tell that this is someone who knows how to draw actual Asian facial features, as opposed to this version, which I love the story. I love the Koreans. I love retellings of the Korean Cinderella, but the illustration ain't it in this book.
Okay, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think I only learned like this year that Cinderella was a Chinese story.
Yeah, I mean, the Chinese version was one of the oldest versions, but kind of similar to how
in Arabian Nights, right?
Yeah, kind of similar to how like Aparna and Ronnie were talking about how there's just like the same myth in different versions in every culture. Every culture has their variant of the Cinderella story. And I think the Chinese version is definitely one of the oldest ones.
I had no idea. I'm going to have to do some research.
And I've got that on my bookshelf too.
We're showing.
I love that her background is a library, and that she's like literally
In the Beauty
running
and the
it.
Beast.
Yeah, I'm like, this
Yes.
is great.
Yeah, so this was the version that I grew up reading, where it was written by Eileen Louie and illustrated. Sorry, it's so blurry. Illustrated by Ed Young. And I think one thing that bothered me growing up as a kid was that the facial features in this book were not very clear. Like, it's got this very beautiful watercolorish, like heavy color. Like, if any of you are into contemporary Chinese art, I think this draws heavily on what's called Yunnan Chinese heavy color art, where there's a lot of emphasis on representing Chinese minorities, a lot of beautiful colors, and a lot of gorgeous like embroidery in the clothing that you don't see in Han clothing. And this was one of my early versions in exposure to seeing like Asian representation in children's fairy tales and picture books in American libraries. So I'm grateful for that, cool. But I'm also kind of glad to see how far we have come in the publishing industry.
I was going to say that for those of you who have middle grade books, this is like one of my favorites by Henry Lian, who is a Taiwanese American.
Oh yeah,
awesome.
Yeah, Peace Sprout Town was really fun.
It's a lot of fun. I mean, he was coached by George R. Martin, so there's like a dark streak going through this children's story. But I really love this book.
It was
very meaning to take one of Henry's workshops, but stars just have not aligned. But I've talked to him, and he's such a cool guy.
Yeah, he signed a book thing for me.
Oh, nice. That's so awesome.
There's something. Oh, go ahead.
I was just gonna say on the retelling side, like the reason I found out about the Cinderella thing was actually because John Cho was in this Wish Dragon animated.
Oh
movie.
yeah.
Yeah, I saw that. I saw
People
that.
were slamming him because they were saying like, oh, this movie is a ripoff of Aladdin. But actually Aladdin, I found out was based off a Chinese story too.
Yep, I was
Yeah.
actually going to say that. Yeah.
Yes, from 101 Arabian Nights, Aladdin took place in China, and it was presented as a Chinese story. And I mean, growing up, the Disney version was my exposure, and it wasn't until I came across like this gorgeously illustrated picture book of 1001 Arabian Nights that I found out, oh, Aladdin took place in China.
Yeah, it was another point I was going to bring up is it was interesting enough that the Persians had a tradition of creating stories about other cultures. So like you just brought up China, one of the oldest stories in the world is called The Three Princes of Serendip, which was the Persian name for Sri Lanka. And it's where the word serendipity comes from. And this eventually also got folded into 1001 Nights, some iterations. And it led to Western authors taking this literary technique, because it's the first story where like there isn't a traditional plot. It's just an adventure of three brothers. Like it was like an adventure story where you didn't need a traditional climax. And later it became really famous because Voltaire actually used it in a story called Zadig, which revolutionized the detective genre. So there's a very big tradition in Western stories to reach for older Eastern stories and certain framing devices and literary techniques, and they reintroduced them into Western canon through their own analogs, and they would like change genres because of it. But for a lot of us in publishing, we never saw that history. So the only exposure a lot of us probably had was seeing it in a Western story without realizing like how much of a disconnect there was from the originals. And it's why I particularly have a fondness for Persian storytelling, because they would actually tell stories of other cultures. They would collect them and retell them and put them together. Like you said, like Aladdin is actually a Chinese story, but they just told it. And then they would tell one about Sri Lanka, but it was with their names, and they would tell them about South Asia, and they would take and cobble the literary techniques. And then I guess because of how many people traded with the Middle East, these stories were later adopted and co-opted by Western authors that were like, oh, this is cool, and I want a translated version of it. And then the French would do a spin-off of it. An Italian author would do a spin-off of it. And then you'd only see it from that point redeveloped through like Western canon.
Here it is. I have this beautiful illustrated version.
Oh, it's beautiful.
You could see there lived a tailor by the name Mustafa in the wealthiest cities of China. And these are some of the drawings.
His name was Mustafa in China.
That looks beautiful.
In China. Yeah. So
great.
yeah, isn't that interesting? You're just like, that's not our Chinese name. But to me, like I find that really beautiful, like how like different cultures kind of blend together, and you see very clearly, like, you know.
Well, they
It's
also
really beautiful.
traded so much. Like there's a beautiful book I would
traded so
recommend
much.
to everyone here. It's called Silk Roads, plural, A New History of the World by Peter Frankopan. And he is like one of the best historians on it. And he talks so much about the religious interplay, trades going on. Like the world's unfortunately not most famous explorer, but should be, was the Marco Polo before Marco Polo. The Ibn Fadlan is an international travel book about a Middle Eastern traveler who was the Marco Polo before Marco Polo. And he went from all the way from the Middle East to Russia. He met with Vikings, went through South Asia, Western countries, learned their techniques, their traditions, traded with them. And he actually brought a storyteller with him, which is part of where I got the inspiration from Tales of Tremaine. Because if you were a wealthy merchant traveling, and you're going through foreign cultures, one of the best things you could do is bring an entertainer with you. They can break the ice. They can turn your travel into a marketable commodity. You know, like let's say you're dining with the foreign governor. You have a performer with you now to like turn your travels into entertainment, and they'll be happy to host you and go like, wow, and be more amicable to trade. And there's this weird, I guess, like idea that so many of our cultures were like very closed off, but they weren't. There are records in South Asia of actual Greek philosophers who were there and left a lineage of people there that after the fall of Greece, there were new Greek philosophers who didn't know Greece had fallen in the traditional sense of what it had been. And they have like Greek philosophy translated into Sanskrit and other iterations of languages there, because there's like 26 languages there. And this is true for so many Asian cultures. Like,
yeah. Have any of you watched The Longest Day in Chang'an? It's a TV series.
I have before, but I haven't seen it.
Yeah, it's this really good Chinese drama set in the Tang Dynasty, Chang'an, basically the capital back then. And it's incredibly detailed in its historical recreation of everything from dress to clothing to, they have a water clock in there, an incense clock, just how they're telling the time and everything like that. But they also do a lot of these things where they bring in, because Chang'an at that time, in the Tang Dynasty, 1049, I think is when it's set up, was such a metropolitan place. It was one of the largest capitals in the world, if not the largest. I can't remember. Those things get kind of argued over too. They had religions from all across the world. From they had slaves from Africa. They had people, and it's just that's historically accurate, and they show it and do it so well. It's like one of my favorite TV shows, really.
Hey, what's it called again? The Longest Day?
Yeah, Longest Day in Chang'an.
The Chang'an 12城, Chang'an 12城,
Chang'an.
Chang'an 12城,
长安十二时辰
12 periods in Chang'an. Yeah.
There's another. Oh, go ahead, please. Sorry.
Oh no, I was going to say that
Forget.
I know all of you for a while, except for I've never ever talked to you, and I'm very curious, like what influences your stories? We haven't really heard much from you at all.
I actually was going to ask a question about like how much fluidity or flexibility do y'all give yourself when you are writing fantasy, when you're like drawing on ancient myths and stories?
Did you just use y'all? I mean, where are you looking?
Yeah, I was trying to find a gender neutral way
that's
to
great,
say it.
because
So it's y'all.
I'm from the
Anyways.
South and I say y'all too. So
Yeah, I'm from
I
the
say
South,
y'all all the
yeah.
time.
Oh yeah, duh, yeah. We're same state.
Y'all is my
Yeah.
language
Also,
now.
they say to just address everybody.
For me, like I actually specifically chose to use a secondary world because part of my motivation was, as the comparative mythology buff, what Tolkien did with Lord of the Rings was he tried to recreate a new pre-Arthurian mythology for Britain, because at the time he was writing, it was very Arthurian myth dominated. But Britain's heritage, so much of it is other European myths and folklore. And with The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings, what he really did was he took Beowulf, Des Ring de Nibelung, which is a Finnish or Danish play, which is literally like the Ring of Power. And a lot of his influences, you can see, come from European folklore, like quite literally to characters and plot devices and mythology. But he reinterpreted them, and he used his skills as a linguist to create new languages that have traces when you read it to like, oh, this is Finnish and Danish and German. So I have analogs to stuff in my books that sound very much like Sanskrit or Hindi and Punjabi, but they're not, but they're close enough. And I let me play with that of this will be familiar to South Asian authors and readers, but also hopefully be accessible to Westerners and have the cadence and the sound and be like a functional colang without you having to have the onus and burden of you must be 100% mythologically accurate. So it straddles the line. And I thought maybe that was the best thing to do, because it also removes the onus of I must be 100% correct to South Asian mythology, which then might make it harder for a Western audience to read, or open me up to, you have zero flexibility of this myth, so how dare you do this? Now you're wrong.
I think what I love, I don't know how you guys feel about this, but I love having Easter eggs in my books where like, if you're part of the culture, you'll get it. And it's like a little reward for us.
Yes.
Right. It's like, if you know the culture, like you will get a better reaping of it. Like, for example, one of the big concepts in my book is called Agnipath, and Agnipath literally means path of fire, but it's also there's a poem actually by the father of one of the most famous Bollywood actors of all time, Amitabh Bachchan, and his dad was a very prominent poet.
Yeah.
And he wrote this poem called Agnipath about the freedom fighters of India who were fighting the British for freedom. So there's a lot of like meta stuff that happens because in the book they're literally fighting against this this about to go to war with this nation called Janthar, which is pretty much the British, and the main character is tasked to walk the Agnipath, the walk of fire. Like everyone in her family must walk it. And the way the poem goes, and this is why I wish I really understood Hindi poetry, it says, it's this very beautiful musical poem, but it says like, you walk the Agnipath. You can't, like, if you can't ever turn around, you can't stop walking, you can't stop underneath a tree for shade, you can't stop for water, no matter what, you can't stop walking. And that's the true power of the Agnipath. Like you must go on. There's no relief for you. And it just, to me, it causes a lot of like the idea of duty, of dharma, like what you owe to people, what you owe to your family, to your kingdom, and just like also your ancestry. And it's all bottled in that poem. So if you know what that is, it's like a complete unlock, little Easter egg. I mean, you'll get that from the, from the
That's a
text
huge
itself.
Easter egg. Holy
It's
crap.
a huge, yeah. But like, if
But
you
that's
know
what
the
makes it
poem,
special. Yeah.
that's what makes it
Like
so
I can't
special.
wait to read yours. Like I'm hoping
Yeah,
your editor gives me an arc. Like I'm waiting.
There was you know, it's funny, like I like, so I make a lot of reels and TikToks to like promo the book, which I'm sure some of y'all have seen. I'm sorry if it's annoying, but I gotta get the post. I literally am posting every day and I'm like, I'm sorry, this is cringy, but it's working. And what I love to do, like growing up, I think someone was saying like they grew up with C dramas. Was it you, Joe, who was talking about like growing C? So like, yeah, so I grew up like watching Bollywood films all the time, watching like Bollywood, like Indian like TV dramas like all the time with my mom because that's what they would watch. Like I didn't know I wouldn't get pop culture references in school. Like I didn't know what Star Wars was. I didn't know Star Trek because my parents never watched it and I didn't know. I know now I do. But I felt like I was playing catch up in a lot of my life to understand what my peers were talking about because I was looking at a different type of storytelling. I have a filmy heart, and I love to like little Bollywood Easter eggs. So it's really fun. So, like I put this one like Bollywood Easter egg about this is very classic. Like her scarf gets like caught, her dupatta gets caught in his sleeve, and they turn around and it's like very, very Bollywood. And it's such a like, if you know it, you're like, oh my God, I know where this is from. Like it hits you right in the heart. And I made a reel about it. And because TikTok is banned in India, so there wasn't as much like payoff. But when I posted on Instagram, everyone's like, I know, like the Indian audience like totally gravitated towards it. And it's fun. It's fun because you're like, you know, the secret behind, and it's like fun to be kind of in the ins of it.
I expect now like a Shah Rukh Khan Easter egg at some point, reference or later.
Oh, there is.
Okay, I was like, I have to see that because I did actually sneak one into the first binding. Nobody got it, but there is one, and then I actually have spoilers, but the books have been out, so I have a romantic present day climax, which is literally just a Bollywood dance scene. Like that's all it is. It's
awesome.
Flat out like a Bollywood dance, and then Aparna, when you get a chance to see it, you'll see like I've got stuff for mango lassi, like I literally without the full recipe, but like Indian foods all through it, like actual stuff that like if you're a kid you grew up with, like I don't know if you've gone back, so if you ever got like ruhafza gola, like the shaved ice with like that rose syrup on it. So like this is probably why people have diabetes there, but like one really cheap treat that if you're like, you know, that anyone can get on the street is there's shaved ice carts. And I make this with magic in my book, and people will like form the ice over like, you know, just a wooden stick, like a popsicle. And there's something that's called ruhafza, which is like a concentrated rose syrup. It's like bright red, it's super sugary and sweet, and they would just put that over the ice and you just suck and lick it and eat it. And it's so good. That, or like you could actually get like just cuts of sugarcane, like pure sugarcane. It's just stripped and you can just get it to chew on, which tears your mouth up worse than like Captain Crunch, but it's just pure sugarcane juice, which is so smooth and sweet and cooling. Like if you're in Delhi and it's super hot and you just go through it, or sugarcane juice. And like there are all these cultural little tidbits I've been trying to include that like there are moments where the editor is like, oh, this is great food stuff, but like does it need to be in there? And I'm like, yes, because there's like 2.6 billion people that will understand why that's important. And it's like a thing of daily life. Like it matters.
Guys, I am going to write a Bollywood dance sequence into my Chinese wuxia novel, and you guys will know it. It's just because of YouTube.
Do it.
I
Absolutely do it. Yeah, absolutely. Because I'm going to consult one of you because my book's Silk Road set. So at some point, my character's going to go to the version of China I want to do, and I'm going to make him go through like, now you get to do 36 Chamber of Shaolin love letter. Like you're the foreigner who has to go through this, but I want it to be accurate. But like also you're a foreigner, so he can at least accurately go like, I'm not seeing it through an authentic lens. He won't ever try to represent that. He goes like, I know I'm an outsider, but like at least I'm being welcome, and he gets to see it. Because part of one thing of my series was I wanted it to be a love letter to all Asian cultures that traded with each other. Because I study like the history of trade too. Like, and I think that's beautiful that all of us have that like connection in a way of that these cultures were not isolated and they're not monoliths.
Yeah.
So Julia, Ken, do you guys want to answer for Ebony?
So I think for Ken and I, we were extrapolating. So for example, our book opens with the story of Izanami, like the ebony gate is the stone that is holding back Yomi, right? So it's after the husband ran away from his wife, right? And there wasn't a lot that we found about that, but we didn't need to retell it, right? It was just the premise of this is why your protagonist is having this adventure because of what happened from before, right? So there were a couple instances like that where, for example, we were talking about the 9 sons of the dragon. Well, there isn't a lot in translation about it, and it's really, as far as we could determine, mostly ornamental, like in its callbacks now all over China. It's on the bells, it's on the roofs, it's on the bridges, but that gave us the freedom for Ken and I to sort of say, well, what if we wanted some drama in here? What would we say? And so in that sense, it almost became a secondary world fantasy, like the way Ronnie was talking about.
And I think, I think between our first draft and our final draft, we also had discussions about like, how much do we expect our readers to be able to know, like before they get into this, or, and versus like how accessible do you want the book to be, like Ronnie was saying. And so, you take the things that are going to add that extra life to your story, but you also don't want it to be like an encyclopedia entry, and of course, with our early reviews, we tried to straddle the line. And of course, we've already gotten reviews that are like, oh, you guys explained everything too much. And, oh, you guys didn't explain anything enough. So apparently there's no right answer.
There's no right answer.
So
There's never a right answer.
Yeah. So ultimately I think you should write what feels comfortable for you. That's I think ultimately that's what you have to be true to.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So,
like-
so to answer your question, I was thinking, like with my stuff, I kind of pulled the page out of oh, thanks, Siri. I pulled a page out of Avatar: The Last Airbender that kind of had like, you have your cultural basis, but then you've also got like sly little pop culture references here and there and stuff like that. Like when I don't have quite the epic Easter egg that ties into mythological stuff, but I had a lot of fun with Kung Fu Panda, right? When Master Sifu is named Master Sifu, it's like Master, right? And so I did stuff like that in my book, like everybody doesn't get it. And then I had one reader that's like, did you really name your farmer Tudo, which means potato, right? Which is something a farmer would grow. So I was like, I did, good job. Here's some swag for getting that, and I did find a way to work BTS into this series that was on the background here. Like I just I call them BT on, so it's like actual Chinese, and RM is R-un. It's like just slight variations, and I don't know. For me, it's just for fun. For me, like I think you can be very. That's why I wrote in an adjacent Chinese world rather than like in historical China. It's like it gives me a little bit of creativity. Let me play around with it a bit and have some fun with it, while also still striving to be authentic. Where I kind of keep it canon is with the language. So I only exclusively use Mandarin and Pinyin pronunciations and everything for that. So, less fantasy, but more of that concrete world, I guess. I don't know.
I was gonna say, Ronnie, you just messaged that, but like the Avatar, I love ATLA. Like my book has fire wielding or fire bending, which is like people who love ATLA. There's like a moment where there's a cart and it's like apples, and my apples, and it's like the cabbage guy.
Oh my god, I did
the
that
cabbage
too,
guy.
book two.
I have an apple guy. He's like my apples. I'm like, that's the cabbage guy.
I'm doing dates literally in book 2. I've got a date vendor, the exact same thing. So it's like my dates.
It's so good. It's so fun, and I feel like if you like. I always say like it's fire bending or fire wielding, so people already know it's like ATLA. But what's interesting about ATLA, which I love about it, is that the way it infuses, like Buddhism came out of Hinduism, so there's so much crossover. Like the word, and Ronnie just messaged this, but avatar comes from avatara, which literally is the basis, like Vishnu's avatars, his reincarnations. That's what the concept of avatars came from. But also this idea of like, what I loved in ATLA was that all their to do bending, it was either through dance, or it was like a form of dance or martial arts, which a lot of there's this and you know, historians can debate this. There's this one Indian martial arts called Gullery, which was made in South India, which some people say a monk and then brought to China, and
Bodhidharma.
Yeah, he brought it to China, and that became Kung Fu. So what's interesting is that with ATLA, is that, I mean, dance is so much a big part of in Hinduism, because when the gods dance, they're basically destroying things.
Yes.
So when Shiva dances, he's destroying. When Ma Kali dances, she's destroying, and she's creating power. So like that carried over into Buddhism, and then that's where ATLA derives from both. So it's really cool to see, like we were talking about, the blending of cultures of like, oh my gosh, that's like a Sanskrit term, and they're doing dancing, but it's also martial arts. It's like Kung Fu and Gullery. It's like, it all goes together. It's so
there's
fun.
a history of fire dancing in South Asia, as well as the term which you also talked about earlier. When you said Agnipat, also in Avatar, they have Agni Kai. But it's Agni. Yeah, Agni is the South Asian word for fire, as well as also the name of the South Asian deity of fire. So it's very interesting. Like ATLA sort of drew from like so many beautiful Asian cultures and coalesced it and made it very accessible to Westerners. And I think somebody, I forgot who was, a fantastic martial artist, actually broke down the specific styles of martial arts that every bending kingdom uses, like what they're analogous to. And I was like, that's so fascinating that they did the research that well. And it just
Tai Chi,
yeah, the water thing looks like Tai Chi. I mean,
Tai Chi, Pakwa, which is the air. I can't remember.
Fire bending is long fist.
Yes.
Oh,
bending is long guard.
Yes.
Yeah.
I sounded
like, bending is
JC would know.
Yeah.
It's such a interesting thing. I think for a lot of us, if you want to write, you know, really tight history stuff, it takes so much work that most of us take a step sideways. Alice Pun recently put out her book, The Heavenly Sword, and she's really tied to history. From what I've understand, I haven't read it very far in yet, but she's trying to tie in really close. And people like Jin Yong.
She went full Jin Yong tribute with that one, like with the historical aspect of it.
Yeah, all of these. That's you really need to know your stuff to go and do that, and be willing to, you know, spend the time researching it and understanding it. And sadly, I am horrendous at details, so I took a step sideways. So mine's very close, but not the same. And I use a lot of footnotes in my work just to explain some things, because sometimes I bring in concepts and it's too much to try to go and explain it to people. But if I don't explain it, people aren't going to understand it, and I don't want to take it out. So I put a footnote in there. Also, it lets me go and put random footnotes, like Pratchett, who, you know.
Oh yeah, that's my style. I've got all my jokes are in my footnotes. So if you read my books, don't skip the footnotes.
I want to give a huge shout out to the people who do their research, especially with retellings. And I don't know how many of you have read this one. She Who Became a Star.
Audiobook, also by Natalie Gonis.
Absolutely brilliant.
What I have to do to get the arc for book 2.
And then the other one would be, I think it's Joan He. She does Strike the Zither, which is kind of a retelling of the Three Kingdoms. It has a lot of the events of the Three Kingdoms as well. So.
Yes, actually, I want to hold up a show and tell book 2. This is Deep as the Sky, Red as the Sea. It's the Chinese pirate queen. Retelling epic. And so I got the arc for this, and it's next on my TBR pile. I cannot wait.
I need to ask for that, because I know the history. I've never read like a retelling though. That's fascinating.
Yeah,
I still want to read that.
I think Stevie Lee. There have been a couple, but I'm really excited about this one. So But yeah, I suspect that you have to be so faithful or meticulous, or at least extrapolate from the sources that you do have, even though, you know, this is maybe like 500 years ago or whatever that you're looking at.
I find that when I try to draw on myths and folklore, I try to be very meticulous with my research, but then I find that my writing style does not lend well to retellings, if that makes sense. I like to be very flexible. So I find that I tend to use folklore mythology in like a very contemporary context and to comment on current society rather than like past history.
That's what
That's really
mythology
cool.
does, right? They're just commenting on their contemporary times, right?
Yeah, that's a good point.
You're
Okay.
you're doing the thing.
You're doing the thing, yeah.
You're fine. So it's 9. We've been at this for like an hour, 20 minutes. I'm probably going to get things thrown at me if I keep this up for very much longer. Not by you guys, but you know, within my
Also, that's
household.
also very Asian, though.
Yes.
Have like a
So why don't we go around the opposite of what we started, and everyone can, you know, throw a pitch at your latest work. Starting with Aparna.
Yeah. Well, I have the characters in the background for the Phoenix King. So behold, look at in all their beauty. But this is the book. Oh no, it's called The Phoenix King. It comes out with Orbit August 29th. And it's an Indian inspired epic fantasy. So it's not a retelling, but it uses Indian mythology and Hinduism to create the fabric of the world and inspire some of the characters. And it's about an assassin, a princess, and a tyrant's struggle for power when a vengeful god reawakens and threatens to send a prophet to retake her kingdom. So it's lots of firebending, a lot of female rage, some Bollywood Easter eggs for those of you interested. And it talks a lot about something that I'm always interested about, like the hyphenations of identity, like people who live in between. Yasin is mixed race, but white passing. And also the blur of church versus state, which we're seeing a lot in both India and America and just around the world. So if you like religion and politics, it might be up your alley.
I don't know if anybody remembers who's next.
Yeah, because it's different, I think, for everybody, like left to right.
Yeah. Julia?
Okay, so I guess I'm not as good at self-promo as Ken. So Ken has the background with the book, and Ebony Gate is coming out July 11th because he has it in giant font behind his head. You know, we pitched the book as Asian female John Wick with dragon magic, and
good pitch.
It was really for fun, right? Like we were like, what if? And they fight Asian monsters. And so we got very excited when we wrote this passion project. But I think what it ended up turning into is really a story about being an outsider and trying to become an insider and just straddling that line, you know, between two cultures, which I think as a diaspora kid, I think most of us can also relate to that experience of wanting to fit in.
Yeah, she's magical diaspora, but it's a, you know, it's a stand-in for the kind of diaspora experience that Julia and I had growing up.
I feel like magical diaspora is like stretch goals for all of us.
Yes, leveling up.
Joe?
I wish I had a book that I could promote, but I guess I will just say I am available for audiobook narrations, and editors, watch out for me and my agent because we are coming back on sub for you.
Yay.
Dun, dun, dun.
Good luck, you guys.
Evo?
All right. So this in the background is it's a serial story that's currently on Kindle Vella. It's called Why I Swore to Never Hire a Goon Except in Emergencies. And I know it's a great title. And it's basically like a screw up Ocean's 11 in ancient China, right? So like get the worst of the worst together to pull off a heist where the main character's little sister goes missing and he's a total screw up. And that's always, you know, full of failed business ventures. And he realizes he can't hire a hero, but goons, on the other hand, are cheaper. And so it's the worst kind of heist possible.
I applaud his like fiscal responsibility though. It's like I can't afford a hero, so I'll at least be like I'll budget accordingly. That's also very Asian.
That's the one with the BTS references and Easter eggs, and it takes place in my storytelling world where the main world is where the Tales of the Swordsman series takes place, and this, if I can hold it in the right way. Anyway, it literally just came out today on audio books, so you can get it. Like literally today it cleared ACX, and I was like, oh my gosh, I have an audiobook out now.
I want promo codes.
Yeah, I'll definitely send some over if anybody of you guys are interested. But
I'll listen. I love listening to audiobooks.
So be nice because I narrated it all myself. And I consulted Joe on like, how do I do these voices? How do I do this software? And but it was a lot of fun. You have a good voice.
I'm sure you're great. I'm excited to listen.
Well, let me tell you, like that's one of those things you discover on your indie journey is like all the hats you have to wear, and middle-aged woman and teenage girl hats were not what I was expecting.
I love that.
How about
Congratulations. That's an accomplishment.
Gotta play.
Awesome.
Yeah. I gotta stop writing female characters, apparently.
So John, what do you have?
I'm kind of in a writing slump. I haven't really produced much in a while. But what I'll do is
you finished something today, remember?
I did finish a short story for the anthology that many of us are doing, Wuxia Anthology, but I won't talk about that. I'll talk about, this is the main book that most people who know me.
That's a beautiful cover.
And, I basically pitch it, the short pitch is Game of Thrones meets Avatar: Last Airbender, narrated by Natalie Nadas. And it is about a young misfit with a perfect voice to evoke the lost magic of dragon songs, only to no teacher, so she has to figure out by observing all the other kinds of magic in the world. Book 1 centers around a Western-style lute made from a dragon scale, and only a dragon singer can coax the magic out of it. She has to learn how to do it before her father, the Emperor, marries her off to a tyrant. There's also a spy thriller component where 2 snarky ninjas have to uncover a plot against the throne. All comes together in an explosive ending. It's part of a 4-book complete series full of action and adventure like my Monday mornings, backstabbing and betrayal like Tuesday nights, and a little bit of enemies to lovers, slow burn romance like my Wednesday to Saturday.
Look at that elevator pitch. That was amazing.
Yeah. I do it at every convention.
I was going to say, I've heard this at the convention.
I was going to say, you heard it over at
I love the fact that your voice changed as well.
Yeah, he did. He got very announcery.
Great. So great. John, you need to show us the 4th book's cover, because that one is my favorite.
This is actually book 3. It's out of order. This is my favorite too.
I absolutely adore this cover.
Oh, that is really nice.
I love the movement.
Yeah,
Who did you
I point to this every time I get an illustrator. It's like, something like this, please.
Who did you hire for the art?
His name is Bing Hai. He's a Vietnamese artist, but he's not very reliable. In fact, the actual book 4, I had to get another artist who has a very similar style.
Wow.
He's actually, he never finished book. I paid him for it, but he never finished book 4.
Oh.
Yeah. And I actually just sold my 77,000 copy from the series. So.
Nice. Wow. Congratulations.
Wow.
Hi.
Well, everything I'm working on is fantasy, but everything I have out is not fantasy. So
it'd be like that.
Awkward situation, yeah. But what I'm working on is basically like a sci-fi fantasy. It's a post-apocalyptic world that draws inspiration from Chinese opera performance culture. But what I actually have out is a modern ghost story about a neighborhood of haunted houses where people go to buy these houses to live with the ghosts of their dead loved ones.
Oh, that's cool.
If y'all and then another very meta thing called I Am I, because I had to play with my name at some point, about toxic productivity and living in a world that's dominated by AI.
That's really cool.
That's
wow,
cool.
That's awesome. AI.
I know. I love the pun on that. I actually have to go and get that from you at some point to go and read that over. And Ronnie?
Yeah, so I don't have anything out this year. My book was delayed because of publishing stuff. And it's also probably going to be the largest book next year, unfortunately. Sorry for everybody. Like, I'm probably the reason behind print costs going up. But book one, the first binding came out last October, and it's pretty much the idea of like a love letter to all storytelling. The main character is a legendary storyteller, but he's lived like the most fantastic life of legend and myth. And in the present day, he's in hiding. His story has been retold so much by himself that nobody remembers the real him. And they've sort of co-opted his story through all different cultures and renamed him, sort of like stuff we've talked about because I'm a comparative mythology buff. So the series starts off, he's in a foreign country trying to find a secret hidden story. And someone finds out who he really is. And he starts telling her as they start falling in love, his real story. So it's a framed narrative, takes past and present about how he became like a murderer as a child. And you start figuring out what the lies and truths are because he might not be a murderer, how he killed a country's god, how he dropped a mountain. And it goes into all sorts of like stuff that if you've read the Odyssey, you'll see notes of any kind of famous story. Most of the bloodlines of 90% of fantasy DNA are in here. And it's talked about. This is like a love letter to storytelling, a meta-analysis of storytelling, comparative mythology, a commentary and reply to some of our favorite fantasy books, all done through like a Silk Road lens, because that's how storytelling evolves. And as people have seen here, my mythology thing, that's something I'm very passionate about, the connection between mythology. And the second book is coming out next year, The Doors of Midnight. It's already been announced, and we'll see what the final word count is, because book 2 was turned in at 450,000 words.
Oh my god.
What?
Yeah. And I've been told to cut it down because of the print size, and that's it. Like, it's just too big. So we'll see. It's still probably gonna be the chunkiest book out next year, unless Brandon drops Stormlight 5. Yeah, if you want, like,
It's possible.
which is possible, yeah. Or if George drops Winds of Winter, yeah, that one. Oh, like, yeah. But otherwise, if you want like a lot of bang for your buck, book 1 is 350,000 words. Like, that is like 3 epic fantasies in one.
Yeah.
It's also eligible for like every award this year right now. I just found out, so there's that too.
Nice.
Good luck.
Thank you.
All right. And I guess I should pitch mine.
Yes, you should.
I'm going to talk. I actually have a serial right now going out on Starlit Publishing called Climbing the Ranks, which is set in Malaysia, present-day Malaysia, but slightly in the future Malaysia, with it's a cultivation-lit RPG, tower-based world. And so, yeah, if you want to see someone, and we should have a audiobook coming out within the next couple of months when it actually releases on Amazon. Tantor's doing that, and I am really curious to see what happens. We've been working really hard with Tantor trying to find a narrator who can handle the Manglish that I have thrown at them. Because, yeah. So, yeah, you know, we're talking about random cultures and everything. Climbing the Ranks has Manglish running right through it, mostly from conversational Manglish with specific characters, because I didn't really want to write an entire book in Manglish. It's a little much. Anyway, I guess that's it. I'm gonna call it a day. It's been over an hour and a half of pleasure talking to all my friends, and sure you guys can find all of them on Twitter or Facebook, or TikTok in some cases.
When I say Facebook,
thank you for watching.
Gen Z.